In front of you is a 2006 Yamaha FZ6. Today I'm going to go over the bike, give you a walk around and tell you about it, and then I'm going to take it for a ride so you can see what it's like on the road and what I think about how it actually rides. Starting at the wheels and tires, it's got 17-inch tubeless tires front and rear. The front has dual rotor disc brakes and the rear has a single rotor disc brake. This bike is fuel injected and it is a 4-cylinder 600cc motor that Yamaha adapted from the R6 to put in this chassis. Because of that, it is a little bit detuned, supposedly for more mid-range torque rather than the top-end power of the R6. Because where the R6 makes over 100 horsepower, this is sitting somewhere around 90. This bike in specific has a carbon fiber eBay special exhaust. It has frame sliders, handlebar spacers, and an extended windscreen. Other than that, it is almost completely stock. It is really just these little tasteful mods that help make it catered to the rider. Getting that power to the ground is a 6-speed manual transmission with chain drive. Now, while this does have the same motor as the R6, it is a very different bike. It's much more upright and sport touring inspired than the R6. You sit almost completely upright. It is more upright than any sport bike I've ever seen. Personally, I've ridden the SV650 and I've sat on quite a few Ninja 650s, and none of them come close to the comfort that this gives. Additionally, the fuel tank on this bike is about 5 gallons, which means you can get a safe range of about 200 miles on one tank, depending on how you ride. But that's enough talk. I'm going to get this bike on the road so you can see what it's like to drive the 2006 Yamaha FZ6. Of course, it's got an electric start and all the amenities you'd expect. I have to say, I love the exhaust tone on this bike. Even with the cheapo eBay exhaust, it sounds fantastic. Alright, that's enough of that. I am burning on fire, so let's go. Right off the bat, you can notice the gauges. It's got one digital gauge in the middle. It's not really fancy, and I don't love the fact that you don't get an analog tachometer with this bike. I really don't like having this little digital tachometer, but it works and it's there. On the right, you get a fuel gauge and a thermometer with a clock. There is a neutral light, a brights indicator, a check engine light, and an oil pressure indicator. Hopping on to the FZ, the first thing that you notice is the power delivery. While it does have a lot of power up top, it is super reserved at the bottom, and you have to just work your way up into the power band. It's a long, steady build, but eventually it does get there, and it does start to come alive more like the R6 counterpart. And it's for this reason that a lot of people like recommending the FZ6 as a great beginner bike, because it truly is. A lot of people don't want to get 250s as their first bike, and it's understandable because 250s can, some of them barely go on the highway and have little passing power, that kind of thing. Now, I understand that you can ride a 250 very hard with more skill. Obviously, that's true. But for a lot of people, they want more power, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's where I think a bike like this does great, because you can ride it super responsibly and easily. It's very manageable at low RPMs. It rides honestly kind of like a 250. Right now I can give it all the beans and little happens. But the moment that I downshift and it comes alive. Now, sure, this doesn't have quite as much power as the R6, but to be honest, I really don't care. I've owned this bike for about 3 months, and it has plenty of power for me on the twisties and keeping up with sport bikes. My lack of skill as a rider is far more prohibitive than any engine characteristic. The sound of the engine is fantastic. It's a smooth fuel-injected 4-cylinder. There's really not much to complain about. The engine on this bike is great. Just know that there's not a whole lot down low. Because of this, I wouldn't really recommend the FZ as an around town commuter. It's much better on the highway or moving on country roads like this, but it's really not a great low speed, choppy road bike. And that leads me into my next category, which is suspension. It's not that great. It's nothing to write home about. The R6 or whatever you want to compare it to probably has better suspension. This bike feels a little bit sloppy in the front end, it's weakly sprung, and it doesn't feel very confidence-inspiring when you're really leaned over in a corner. That said, it works, and most people would have no problem just riding it and not complaining. The brakes on this bike are pretty nice. Most of the time, you're going to be traction limited or skill limited, really, with brakes. I do like that it has the dual rotors in the front. That's a nice touch. It makes it feel a little bit more high-end. Most of the parts on this bike feel all right, but you can see where it's a little bit cheaper. And it's just not as tight of tolerances on most parts as something like a BMW would be. Now, I have saved the best for last, all right? The best thing about this bike is the ergonomics. You would not take an R6 on a road trip cross country, or at least if you were sane and you valued your pelvic bones, you wouldn't. Meanwhile, this bike you can. Last weekend I put 500 miles on this bike in 2 days, and a lot of that was just sitting on the highway slab going straight. Now, I'm not sure there's really any other bikes that can be so comfortable while still keeping up with the sport bike crowd. And that's where this thing really shines. Yes, it's tamer. Yes, it has a little less power, but you sit upright. It is so ridiculously comfortable compared to other bikes. I've ridden an SV650. In fact, I strongly considered purchasing the SV650. I strongly considered buying one of those, but the ergonomics turned me off. It's much more of a sporty feel than the FZ. Additionally, I've sat on a lot of the Ninja 650s and that style of bike, and none of them seem to match the comfort that this bike has. The wind protection is pretty decent, especially with this bigger windscreen. You can really get down in it and just cruise there. The seat is remarkably comfortable, and importantly, it does not tilt forward. A lot of sport bikes have seats that kind of send you down into the gas tank, and it hurts your private parts a lot. That is in fact one of the very reasons I sold my Ninja 250. I loved my Ninja 250, but if I took it on a ride for more than like an hour, I felt it, man. It hurt. I kept getting pushed into the tank and I couldn't stand it. While the newer FZ6 and FZ6 are fun play bikes, they're not as stable at high speeds or as cheap as the FZ6. I wouldn't want to take an FZ6 on a sport bike ride as much as I would want to take this one. While I would want to mess with the FZ6 around town, to me it feels like a supermoto built for highways. And that's okay, but that's not what I want. For those of you who want that inline 4 sound and feel, there's just no substitute. Now, I'm not dogging on the motor of these newer Yamahas. Everybody who rides them loves them. But they're not the same as an inline 4. They just don't have the same feel. And if that's what you want, you're not going to find that in the FZ6. So who is the FZ6 for? It has the power to keep up with sport bikes, but the tame mid-range and low-end that beginners like and will keep them on 2 wheels. The FZ6 looks great, and it's a nice alternative from the super common aggressive sport bike look that we're all used to. And while it might not be as playful of a bike around town, this is a very good bike at higher speeds and on the highway and long trips like that. Adding to that, you can find FZ6s for less than $4,000 all day long, and frequently they're less than $3,000, especially higher mileage ones. All right, I'm in some neighborhood again. This is neighborhood 3. Let's see if I can get out of it. A few months ago, I was looking for a bike that could keep up with my friends who rode sport bikes. I knew I didn't want a super sport that I was only going to take out every other weekend to do a one-day ride through the twisties. I wanted a bike that I could ride around and have fun on, do longer commutes, and even road trips on. And this is where I landed, because for less than $3,000 you can get a very capable bike that's, sure, it's a little older, but it's very reliable, it's very powerful and good looking, and it's a jack of all trades. I can sit on this a lot longer than I could sit on, Now, what the FZ is bad at is in-town commutes. It's just not as fun around town. It's a little long, it's a little heavy and awkward to throw around city streets with a lot of bumps. The suspension is definitely not as good if you want to do track days and that kind of thing, or even around town especially. It's just not as good as some of these higher-end bikes. That said, you get what you pay for, and this is a much cheaper bike because of this. If you're willing to give up a little bit of power and speed for comfort, then the FZ is a fantastic bike for you. It really does a lot of things well, and while it's not the best at any of them, it covers a lot more ground than any sport bike ever will. I can take this on rides that my WR just can't go on. When my WR is stuck inside because it won't go highway speeds, I take this bike. I'm not saying that the FZ6 is the perfect bike by any means, but I think it would check the boxes for a lot of people at a low price. If that happens to help you out, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.